Yes, the Jews always spoke other languages. They spoke Jewish languages, sometimes more than one, and they spoke non-Jewish languages, often more than one. And yes, there were translations from the early, those of you who know about the early history of the synagogue will know that in the ancient synagogue, when the temple was still there, but the people with real sense decided to stay home and daven in shul, when the temple still existed, there was a figure called the Meturgamon, the translator, whose job it was, as the Torah was read, simply to pause and repeat in Greek or Aramaic, depending on the lingua Judaica, not lingua franca, of the community, so that they would understand what. There were always translations, but the illiteracy of the American Jewish community is literally without parallel by orders of magnitude. So, for example, those of you who remember that in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, Moses Mendelssohn, the great Jewish philosopher, translated the Chumash, the Pentateuch, into Hebrew. It was a work known as the Biur. And as a consequence of this translation, there was brought down upon his head bans, all the anathema of all the great Central European and Eastern European rabbis. This translation was condemned as a huge surrender to German culture, as a huge instrument of assimilation, as the slippery slope to the end of Jewish life. Now, the translation that Moses Mendelssohn made of the Chumash, of the Pentateuch, was not strictly speaking into German. It was into something that was known as Judendeutsch, which meant it was in German words printed in Hebrew characters. If an American Jewish translator were to try to do the same for the Chumash right now, that translation would literally be useless to the vast majority of American Jews. That is to say, we don't even possess the primitive linguistic competence that Mendelssohn's readers possessed 200 years ago. I'm, as you can see, an evangelist on this subject. I'm just going to give you two little anecdotal bits of evidence, just to show you how shameful this situation is. About 10 years ago, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, after his first exile, before he became, he was a good guy, then a bad guy, then a good guy, now he's a bad guy again. During his first round of being a good guy, he was traveling in the United States and he was looking for support, and he convened a meeting of Jewish notables in Manhattan. And they met in a conference room in a law office. They all assembled, and what the Jewish notables didn't know is that, as it happens, Aristide studied in a seminary in Jerusalem for 3 years, and his Hebrew is fluent. He sat down and began to address the Jews in what he took to be their language. After about 5 minutes, one of our Negidim sheepishly turned to him and asked if he could move into English because they didn't know what he was saying. I'll give you another example, this one more from the realm of culture. In 1986, this one I remember very vividly, there was a very remarkable conference of Jewish writers from around the world in Berkeley, California. And at this conference, there appeared a man named Anton Shamas, a good man, politically erroneous, I think, but a good man, an Israeli Christian writer, an Arab, who wrote the sort of Hebrew that made most Israelis green with envy, a phenomenal Hebrew writer. And he believed, as my ex-friend Tony Jutt did, in a single-state solution and so on. And he got up and made a speech about the Hebrew language and said that if there is to be a democratic state of Jews and Palestinians, the Hebrew language will have to be de-Judaized. It will have to be shorn of its Jewish elements. A perfectly foolish sentence. And not just wrong about Hebrew, but wrong about language. I mean, language, you cannot take culture out of language. Language is culture. In any event, he sat down, and there arose a very prominent American Jewish writer, whom I will not name. She went to the microphone, there's a tip, and she thundered that Shamas was committing a kind of cultural genocide in his proposition, in his proposal to de-Judaize the Hebrew language. How dare he suggest this? The Hebrew language is our life and our soul and our spirit. And she sat down. Then there arose an Israeli writer named Chaim Be'er, very interesting man, who wanted to say a few gentle words in defense of Shamas. But his English was weak, so he said that he'd have to speak in Hebrew. And he began to speak in Hebrew. And when he began to speak in Hebrew, I noticed that the great American Jewish writer who had just given her life for the Hebrew language had to put the earphones on so she can understand. In American Jewish culture, there is frequently, or even almost always, an inverse relation between ignorance and knowledge and pride. It is frequently the case that the less Jews know, the louder they talk. And in any case, Our language, to a degree that is no longer appreciated, is our element. It is our soul. It is impossible to know what Judaism is like in English. Impossible. If you have not read Shir HaShirim, if you have only read the Song of Songs, you have not read it. It is also impossible to raise children in any deep, lasting, significant way in translation. There are two things we can give to children. We can give them conviction and we can give them competence. The problem with trying to imbue them with conviction is that, like us, they have free minds for which we should be grateful. And we have no control over what they should believe, nor should we aspire to control what they believe. But what we can give them, what we do have control over, is the competence that they will carry with them throughout their lives as Jews, so that if ever they do freely decide to explore their own tradition, they will not find themselves helpless before it. They will not rely upon the inane translations in drugstore paperbacks and so on. Moreover, a Jewish language gives you something that we think only a Jewish land does, and that is a real sense of peoplehood. When you speak your language, you have the feeling of being inside yourself, not insulated from the outside world, because Jewish culture in its languages was never insulated. And quite the contrary, we evolved and developed and grew as a consequence of all the collisions, the intellectual collisions, the religious collisions, not insulated, but just this feeling of actually going into your house and closing the door behind you and being with yourself and your own and yours. Now, this is something that we have been taught that Zionism provided, that the Jews had to return to the land for. And this is true for those Jews who returned to the land. But most Jews did not return to the land. And we sit here in America quite finely and rightly. I mean, we are free people. We have a right to live wherever we choose. The one thing that we should not do is say next year in Jerusalem at the Seder every year, because it's becoming very hypocritical. But in any case, most American Jews did not. There is, however, this other resource, this other land, this other territory that we carry within us that is portable, from which nobody but us can rob us. No one can take this away from us. Only we can take this away from us, which is where the language does differ from the land. And that is the Hebrew language itself. And not coincidentally, the first great historic achievement of Zionism was not the Jewish state. It was the Hebrew language. It was the Hebrew language. That was what created the Yishuv. That is what allowed Jews from all over the world to cohere as a single community. Not the address, the language. Okay, then. I'll finish it. When we do this cheshbon on this 350th year, then the question that we really have to ask ourselves and really be thinking about a lot is, what is the standard by which we should judge ourselves? And the standard I propose to you is not the American standard, and is not even the American Jewish standard. It is the standard of the Jewish tradition. We have fallen heir to one of the great civilizations in human history. The question we have to always ask ourselves is, did we enrich it or did we impoverish it? What did we do with it? What did we do with it? And the question we have to ask ourselves then is not, what have we contributed to America? Because we know how much we have contributed to America. But what have we contributed to ourselves?